Mormons have this weird behavior where they seem compelled to repeat over and over again how true the Book of Mormon is. Not just once or twice, but over and over and over and over again. And not just declarations about how true the Book of Mormon is, but apparently, according to Jared Bell on the bottom right, he says, I remember this being one of the best nights on X for the Latter-day Saints. Who remembers that night? So one of the best nights ever for Latter-day Saints was the time that they spammed a PragerU thread with the name of Russell M. Nelson over and over again.
Hey, want to hear the most annoying sound in the world?
Now, I'm not sure what they think they gain from this, because just repeating something does not make it so. I suspect, and I think I've heard ex-Mormons confirm this, that the LDS encourages these kinds of faith affirmation chanting as basically a brainwashing method. Repeat it over and over again, and soon enough you might actually start to believe it. I also suspect that the impulse to repeat it over and over and over and over again is probably a sign that maybe they don't believe as much as they claim they do. But you have to remember, if you grew up in Utah, if you're a Mormon, your entire life revolves around a church. You might go to a Mormon university, you might be expected to marry a Mormon wife. The pressure to live, to marry, to school, to grow up and age and die within the Mormon world is very strong. So there's a reason why it is difficult for people to leave the cult. But how true really is the Book of Mormon? So as you know, the Book of Mormon is the history of the Americas. It contains the history of the Jaredites, who landed supposedly in around 2200 BC, who came from the Tower of Babel area, followed by the Nephites, followed by the Israelites, who split into the Nephites and the Lamanites. And there was another group, I believe they're called the Mulekites. I probably missaid that, but these were also ancient Middle Easterners who were said to have traveled across the sea to land in the Americas. So according to the Mormons, so for example, Ophelia Musing, the Nephites and Lamanites were Jews, so she's referring to modern-day Native Americans. And for the majority of the history of the LDS Church, before the advent of DNA, Mormons taught that the Native Americans were Hebrews. Here is the Mormon prophet Spencer W. Kimball stating, quote, they are not Orientals. In other words, the Native Americans are not Orientals. They are from the Near East. It is not impossible that there could have seeped across the Bering Strait a little Oriental blood, as claimed by some people, but basically these Lamanites, including the Indians, are the descendants of Lehi, who left Jerusalem 600 years BC. The fact of the matter is, no ancient DNA from Native Americans has a single drop of Middle Eastern blood, period. But they want to leave a little room here and claim it's just a majority of DNA, as if there's something there that maybe can be historical to the Book of Mormon. And they go on. Basic principles of population genetics suggest the need for a more careful approach to the data. The conclusion of genetics, like those of any science, are tentative. So here's another lie. From any science, everything is tentative. While the field of genetic studies is still developing, there's still researching and finding new things all the time. The ancient city of Chichen Itza in Yucatan, Mexico, one of the largest and most influential Maya settlements during the late and terminal classic periods between AD 600 to 1000, and it remains one of the most intensively studied archaeological sites in Mesoamerica. A long story short, they found 64 subadult individuals that are children, 64 children dating to around 500 AD to 900 AD that were found in subterranean mass burials near the sacred cenote sinkhole in the ceremonial center of Chichen Itza. Genetic comparison to present-day people in the region shows genetic continuity of the ancient inhabitants of Chichen Itza. So in other words, we have the DNA of these people going back very far, and they still exist. The Mayans are still alive and well in the Yucatan, other areas, and they don't have a single drop of Hebrew DNA. Now, what does the science say about where Native Americans came from? Well, it says that they didn't come with the Israelites in the year 2200 BC. They didn't come with the Nephites or the Lamanites, who split off from the Nephites. We have tribes related to Native Americans that are still in the area of central Siberia. So Native Americans did not arrive from the Middle East. They did not arrive from the Tower of Babel like the Jaredites. They came over the land bridge from Siberia and Asia. And this is not compatible with what was originally taught by the Mormon Church. Again, Mr. Prophet Kimball says they are not Orientals, does Joseph Smith say on the matter. He says, quote, in this important and interesting book, the Book of Mormon, the history of ancient America is unfolded from its first settlement by a colony that came from the Tower of Babel, in other words, the Jaredites in the year 2200 BC, at the confusion of languages to the beginning of the 5th century of the Christian era. We are informed by these records that America in ancient times has been inhabited by 2 distinct races of people. I repeat, 2 distinct races of people. Not many, only 2. The first were the Jaredites, and they came directly from the Tower of Babel, says Smith. The second race came directly from the city of Jerusalem about 600 years before Christ. They were principally Israelites of the descendants of Joseph. The Jaredites were destroyed about that time that the Israelites came from Jerusalem, who succeeded them in the inheritance of the country. And here's another quote. I was also informed concerning the aboriginal inhabitants of this country. In other words, modern-day Native Americans. And he goes on, and shown who they were and from whence they came. And the Book of Mormon even has internal evidence of this. So at the destruction of the Nephites, we have Mormon himself saying, and now behold, I say no more concerning them, the Nephites. For there are none save it be the Lamanites and robbers that do exist upon the face of the land. And just so you know real quick who the robbers are, the robbers he's referring to are Gadiantons, who according to the Book of Mormon are a secret society of evil Nephites. So when he says robbers, he means Lamanites and evil Nephites. So we know what the LDS originally taught, but now we know that because of DNA studies, it can't be true. It can't be that there are only 2 races. The Mormons have to believe that there were other groups in the Americas who existed in such numbers that they overwhelmed the DNA of the Israelites to such a degree that no DNA studies has ever detected any evidence of Middle Eastern origin for Native Americans. So hence, you have Ophelia Musing writing this post. She states, "The Nephites and the Lamanites were Jews, but you forget that they also mixed with other people who already settled there. I am not Native American. Lamanites becoming Native Americans is not something I have to believe in to have a temple recommend. I believe in Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon, and I follow all the commandments." So her position is, you forget that there were other people living in the Americas, and that's why there's no evidence. And then her other position is, but also I don't care.
The lady does protest too much, methinks.
And then they go on. The Book of Mormon itself, however, does not claim that the peoples it describes were either the predominant or the exclusive inhabitants of the lands they occupied. In fact, cultural and demographic clues in his text hint at the presence of other groups. Now we're going to challenge this. Is it true that the Book of Mormon does not claim that the peoples it describes were either the predominant or the exclusive inhabitants of the land they occupied? Is it true that it's possible that there were other peoples who were so numerous that they could hide, that they could destroy the DNA of the Israelites through so many generations of interbreeding? But first, let me answer real quick this footnote. So it's a reference to an essay where they claim that clues in the Book of Mormon indicate the presence of other populations. So let's see what their evidence is real quick. So here they basically argue that there has to be other groups in the Americas according to the Book of Mormon, because the sheer population numbers given by Joseph Smith don't make sense. That even though there's no mention in the Book of Mormon of any interbreeding, of any other groups, of any other tribes, that because of the size of the population, it must be that the Nephites joined with non-Nephite groups into one larger people, which is not a good argument. The real answer to why Joseph Smith gives such extreme heavy numbers of population size is because he made it all up. It's not because the Nephites actually interbred with anybody. It's because Joseph Smith didn't understand population growth. And then another example. The essay says, well, what about corn? A corn, of course, is a domesticated plant. Someone would have had to have developed that breed. But the Book of Mormon doesn't mention any of that. The Book of Mormon just has corn being a staple almost right away. So how is that possible unless there were other peoples in the Americas according to the Book of Mormon? So therefore, they're claiming this is a hint that the Book of Mormon is telling you that because there's corn, the Book of Mormon teaches that there are other peoples. This is also not a good argument. So as you may not be aware, but Joseph Smith also claims that there were horses in the Americas before the Spanish introduced them. In fact, there are many anachronisms in the Book of Mormon of things that did not exist in the ancient Americas, which exist in Joseph Smith's narrative. So it's not that the Book of Mormon is hinting that there are secret other tribes in the Americas. It's just that Joseph Smith is an idiot.
I guess I'm dumb, but I don't care.
Then a third argument is that they make is that the Jaredites might have had survivors. So according to the Book of Mormon, the Jaredites were annihilated before the Nephites, before the Lehi arrived. But they argue, well, maybe the Jaredites did survive afterwards. So again, the problem with that is our records don't begin with the Jaredites arriving in 2200 BC. They go back 20,000 years over the land bridge. And according to the Book of Mormon, the Israelites sailed over in what are basically magical submarines. That'll be a subject of another video in the future. So no, Israelites do not explain why there is no evidence for DNA in modern studies. But the key thing I want to go over is the fact that the Book of Mormon itself has plenty of evidence that there were only two groups of people in the Americas according to Joseph Smith. So beyond just Joseph Smith telling us there were only two races, the Book of Mormon also tells us there were only two races. I want to go through the Book of Mormon itself just to show you how massive this civilization that Joseph Smith claims existed. Now, these were not just the little isolated tribes lost in a sea of people who came over the land bridge. These were not, because the Lamanites and the Nephites were not small little countries out of 50 or 100 other countries spread out across the Americas. The way the Book of Mormon describes them would require that these people were the empire of the Americas, that they had many major cities, and they were roaming around massive armies, having these epic conflicts, leaving thousands upon thousands of people dead, spread across the entire geography. There's no other conclusion you can have except that these people were the majority people in the Americas as recently as 500 BC when the narrative ends. I'm sorry, the 5th century BC when the narrative ends. So let's take a look. What we have here is a record of a war that Mr. Mormon here has been involved with since he was a little boy, beginning in 321 AD, and this chapter just covers up to the 326. According to Mormon, the whole face of the land had become covered with buildings, and the people were as numerous almost as it were the sands of the sea. So it's the beginning of the war, and the Nephites, they gather an army of about 30,000 people. And presumably the Lamanites had at least an equal amount in opposition to them. And then in year 327, Mormon tells us, the Lamanites did come upon us with exceedingly great power, insomuch that they did frighten my armies. So not just one army, but many armies. And the Lamanites were an exceedingly great power. And then, of course, they lose the city. And then they go into the land of David. They come into the land of Joshua. And then they gather into another city, which, of course, they fortify. And then you have the Lamanites with an army of 40,000 people. And then Mormon, he withstands his army. So he says, I withstood him with 40 and 2,000 people. And then the Lamanites, they had 44,000 people. And then there's another city, the city of Jason. They fortified this city. And it came to pass in that year the people of Nephi again were hunted and driven. And it came to pass that we were driven forth until we had come northward to the land which was called Shem. And they have another city, the city of Shem, which they fortified, and they had to defend against the Lamanites. And they contended with an army of 30,000 against an army of 50,000. Now these are huge armies. I remember Alexander the Great had an army of about 20,000. The Persians had an army of about 200,000. And we're going to see an army that large near the end. But for now, there's those 30,000 versus 50,000 peoples in the Americas. And then we have here the ultimate battle, the final battle between the Lamanites and the Nephites. And these were a massive armies. Because according to Mormon, it says here, I gathered all their people unto the land of Gomorrah. Behold, I, Mormon, began to be old, blah, 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 blah. And they beheld the armies of the Lamanites marching toward them. There is great fear. And it came to pass that they did fall upon my people with the sword and the bow and the arrow, and with the axe and all manner of weapons of war. And it came to pass that my men were hewn down, yea, even my 10,000 who were with me. And I fell wounded in the midst, but he managed to survive. And then all the other captains with their 10,000s, they fell. Another 10,000 fell, another 10,000 fell, another 10,000 fell, another 10,000 fell. If you do the math, the Nephites had an army of 230,000 people fighting the Lamanites, who were so overwhelming that they were able to completely destroy that entire army. And not just the men, that was presumably that army of 230,000 was an army of able-bodied men, I would presume. So if you're not including the women and the children, the total population could have been, I don't know, maybe at least 500,000, maybe 600, 700, 800,000, depending on the elderly, depending on how many children there were, depending on, was there one man for each woman? I don't know, but at a minimum, we're looking at a huge population in just one area being overwhelmed by an army that would have had to have been many times that size to succeed in that victory. So in modern military doctrine, it is often quoted that in order to take a city, to take a fortified location, you have to outnumber your opponents at least by 3. At least I'm going by memory, I could be wrong. And so you have to have a massive numerical advantage. If you look at Ukraine, the Russians are constantly being slaughtered with every small fortification they take, even though they vastly outnumber them. So they have to have those vast numbers in order to take each little fortified area, because the defenders have a massive advantage. So here, unless the Mormons, the Nephites, were dumb enough to fight them in an open field, presumably they're fighting them in a fortified area against an army that's at least 3 times their size. So maybe an army of about 700,000, and in order to win so cleanly, to overwhelm them so badly, it probably would have been an army of about 1 million. And then we have the quote that I showed you earlier. We have this quote from Mormon saying that now, behold, I say no more concerning them, the Nephites, for there are none, save it be the Lamanites and robbers that do exist upon the face of the land. So after we went through that whole presentation, going through the Book of Mormon, how likely is it intermixed with other people to such a degree that there is no DNA evidence for any of them to this day? How likely is it that they were so outnumbered that no trace of their genetic legacy remains? When they had armies of 200,000 on the Nephite side, they had armies of 30,000 here, 40,000 there, 50,000 there, climaxing with a gigantic army of 230,000 on the Nephite side, maybe an army of 700,000 or up to 1 million on the Lamanite side. But you're telling me that these people were a minority in the Americas, and 2, they had such gigantic numbers that no part of their history did they ever encounter any other tribes who presumably were the real majority, who they don't report in any kind of way. And on top of that, how could the Nephites and the Lamanites be a minority when they have all these different cities that are all purely Nephites? These are Nephite cities, Lamanite cities, no reference to any other tribe or empire. And just to clarify what I'm getting at is this. So imagine you have the Nephites and Lamanites who number in the millions of people. They would have to number in the millions of people to field armies of 40,000, 50,000, 200,000, 600,000, or a million men on the field. You need massive infrastructure to manage armies of this size. You need logistics to feed these people, and we have the Lamanites basically chasing the Nephites from city to city to city to city, and there's references to many other cities and many other villages. So these people, these were not a small, inconsequential tribe in the Americas. The Nephites and the Lamanites would have been the biggest, would have had to have been the biggest empires on the scene. And that fits with what the Mormons were teaching before the advent of modern DNA. We have Kimball saying they are not Orientals. We have Joseph Smith saying there were only two distinct races in the Americas. He didn't know about the land bridge. He didn't know about the traveling of peoples from Siberia across the land bridge 20,000 years ago. He didn't know any of that. All he knew, or all he invented, was in the Book of Mormon that there were groups of people from the Middle East who populated the Americas, and the descendants of these people are the modern day Native Americans. There is no room here for interbreeding to magically delete the DNA evidence. There's no room here for any other explanation other than that Joseph Smith was a liar who was telling tall tales which are not supported by any DNA science, period.